The old grandfather clock in the hallway had a habit of skipping a beat every few minutes. It was a small, rhythmic glitch that most people would find irritating. But for those who lived here, it was the heartbeat of the house. Namjoon adjusted the stack of books on the side table, making sure the spines were aligned. He looked over at Jin, who was meticulously arranging a tray of herbal teas, the steam curling slowly into the dim light of the living room. They had spent the last hour preparing the space, dimming the lamps, and fluffing the oversized velvet cushions until the room felt like a soft nest. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared goal of creating a sanctuary where the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. Outside, the sky had finally given in. A steady, rhythmic rain began to fall, first as a hesitant patter against the glass, and then as a full, enveloping drone. It wasn't a storm of anger, but a cleansing, heavy mist that blurred the edges of the garden and turned the distant trees into charcoal sketches. The sound was a physical presence, a wall of white noise that pushed the city's distant hum far into the background, leaving only the cozy interior of the cottage. Namjoon and Jin carefully prepare a cozy, dimly lit living room to create a peaceful sanctuary. As they finish arranging the space, a steady, calming rain begins to fall outside, effectively isolating the house from the noise of the city. Suga shifted his position on the rug, leaning back against the sofa with a sigh of contentment. He had spent the morning organizing the music library, and the mental exhaustion had left him in a state of pleasant lethargy. He watched a single raindrop race its way down the window pane, tracing a jagged, unpredictable path toward the sill. He didn't feel the need to speak. The silence was already full, filled with the scent of dried lavender and the low, comforting hum of the radiator. "Do you think the rain will hold until morning?" Jimin asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he stepped into the room, carrying a stack of thick, knitted blankets. He didn't wait for an answer, instead beginning to drape the wool over the backs of the chairs and across the laps of those already settled. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, ensuring every corner of the living room was fortified against the evening chill. Hosak followed him in, holding a small ceramic bowl of smooth, polished river stones. He set them carefully on the coffee table, arranging them in a spiral that mirrored the slow whirl of the tea leaves in the cups. He had a way of grounding the room, his presence acting like a quiet anchor that kept the atmosphere atmosphere steady. He caught Namjoon's eye and offered a small, sleepy smile, the kind that suggested he was already halfway to a dream. Suga relaxes in the quiet room, mesmerized by the rain on the window. Jimin joins him, distributing heavy blankets to keep everyone warm, while Hoseok adds a grounding touch by arranging river stones on the table. The group shares a peaceful, sleepy atmosphere as they settle in for the evening. Taehyung was curled up in the far corner, his chin resting on the velvet armrest. He had been staring at the ceiling for a while, tracing the intricate patterns of the crown molding, imagining they were maps of forgotten cities. He shifted slightly, his movements slow and heavy, and reached out to pull a stray cushion closer to his chest. The room had become a sanctuary of soft textures and muted colors, where the only requirement was to simply exist in the stillness. Jungkook entered last, his footsteps muffled by the heavy rug. He carried a small, dim lamp that cast a warm, amber glow across the floor, reminiscent of a low-burning fire. He placed it by the window, the light refracting through the raindrops on the glass to create tiny, shimmering prisms on the wallpaper. He sank into the space beside Suga, his shoulder brushing against the others, and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to release the last remnants of the day's tension. Taehyung rests in the corner of the room, lost in quiet contemplation of the ceiling's architecture. Jungkook arrives and places a warm lamp by the window, creating a gentle glow. He joins the others in a state of deep relaxation, completing the gathering of the group in their shared, tranquil space. "Pass me the blue one," Namjoon murmured, though he didn't specify what he was looking for. Jin didn't ask for clarification. He simply reached for the small, indigo-bound journal resting atop the side table and handed it over. The movement was fluid, a practiced choreography of care. Namjoon opened the book to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes of a poet from a century ago. He didn't read them aloud, but he let the rhythm of the words settle into his mind, adding another layer of quietude to the room. The rain intensified, transitioning from a steady drone into a heavy, rhythmic drumming on the slate roof. It was the kind of sound that made the interior of the house feel like a secret, a hidden pocket of warmth tucked away from the dampness of the world. Suga closed his eyes, his head tilting back against the sofa. He could feel the subtle vibration of the house, the way the wind occasionally occasionally brushed against the eaves, but inside, the air remained still and heavy with the scent of steaming chamomile. Jin provides Namjoon with a vintage journal, which Namjoon reads silently to enhance the peaceful mood. Outside, the rain grows heavier, further isolating the group and intensifying the feeling of warmth and security within their cozy sanctuary. Jimin began to hum, a low melodic vibration that barely reached the others. It wasn't a song with a beginning or an end, but rather a gentle loop of sound that synchronized with the falling rain. He shifted his weight, tucking his legs beneath him as he settled into the crook of the sofa. The knit blankets had become a landscape of soft ridges and valleys, and as he leaned back, he felt the collective gravity of the group pulling everyone closer. A slow motion collapse into shared comfort. Hosak reached for his tea, the warmth of the ceramic cup seeping into his palms. He watched as the amber light from Jungkook's lamp flickered slightly, casting long, dancing shadows that played across the spines of the books on the shelves. There was no rush to speak, no pressure to fill the silence with conversation. They had reached a point of kinship where words were secondary to the shared experience of breath and heartbeat. He felt a profound sense of stillness, as if the clock in the hallway had finally stopped skipping and decided to simply beat in time with them. Jimin's soft humming blends with the sound of the rain, fostering a deep sense of connection among the group. As they huddle together under blankets, Hosak enjoys the warmth of his tea and the quiet atmosphere. The group exists in a state of wordless kinship, fully immersed in the stillness and peace of the evening. The BTS members gather in a cozy, dimly lit living room as a steady rain falls outside, creating a sense of isolation and security. They spend a quiet evening together, utilizing blankets, warm lamps, and tea to foster a deeply relaxing atmosphere. Through shared silence and small comforts, the group experiences a strong sense of kinship and tranquility. Ink is still a bit faded on this page, Namjoon whispered, his voice a soft rasp that barely disturbed the air. He tilted the indigo journal toward the amber light, tracing the cursive lines of the poet. He didn't read the words for their meaning, but for their cadence, letting the flow of the old ink act as a bridge between the quiet of the present and the silence of the past. He felt the others drifting, their breathing sinking into a collective, slow rhythm that mirrored the ebb and flow of the rain outside. Taehyung let out a small, contented hum, his eyes fluttering shut. He imagined the house was a great wooden ship, sailing through a sea of gray mist, carrying them all away from the noise of the city and the demands of the clock. He shifted his head, resting it on the velvet cushion, and felt the subtle warmth radiating from Jungkook beside him. The physical proximity was a silent reassurance, a tether that kept them all grounded while their minds floated into the hazy borderlands of sleep. Namjoon quietly admires the aesthetics of the old journal, contributing to the drowsy atmosphere. As the group's breathing synchronizes, Taehyung imagines their home as a sanctuary drifting away from the city. Resting against the cushions, he feels the comforting presence of Jungkook as the group collectively drifts toward sleep. Jin set the tea tray aside with a delicate clink, the sound echoing softly in the hushed room. He didn't move to leave. Instead, he leaned back and let his gaze wander across his friends. There was a profound sweetness in the sight of them. Suga's steady, deep breaths, Jimin's curled form, and the way Hosak's hand remained loosely wrapped around his cup, his eyes half closed in a state of pure serenity. It was a rare alignment of peace, a moment where the external world felt not like a threat, but like a distant memory. Jungkook reached out and dimmed the amber lamp a fraction more, plunging the room into a deep, honeyed twilight. The shadows stretched and softened, blurring the edges of the furniture, until the living room felt like one continuous, soft space. He felt a heavy, pleasant warmth settle in his limbs, a weight that didn't press down, but rather held him securely in place. The drumming of the rain on the slate roof had become a lullaby, a constant, unchanging frequency that smoothed over any remaining jagged edges of the day. Jin looks upon the group with affection, noting the total serenity of his friends. Jungkook further dims the lighting, transforming the room into a soft, twilight sanctuary. The steady sound of the rain acts as a final lullaby, guiding the group into a state of complete physical and mental relaxation. "I think the clock finally stopped," Suga murmured, though he didn't open his eyes to check. The silence that followed wasn't an absence of sound, but a fullness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The rhythmic glitch of the grandfather clock had vanished, replaced by the singular, unwavering pulse of the rain. In that void, the sound of their own collective breathing became the primary melody, slow, deep, and synchronized. It was a quiet communion, a way of saying I am here without the need for a single syllable. Namjoon slowly closed the indigo journal. The soft thud of the cover sounding like a period at the end of a long sentence. He didn't set the book back on the table. Instead, he held it against his chest for a moment, feeling the cool texture of the binding. He looked over at Jin, whose head had tilted slightly toward the window, watching the rain-streaked glass. They were all suspended in a state of weightlessness, as if the gravity of their shared trust had created a pocket of space where time simply ceased to function. The members experience a deep, non-verbal connection as the ticking clock falls silent, leaving only the sound of their synchronized breathing. Namjoon closes his book, signaling the end of the evening's activities. The group remains in a state of shared trust and stillness, feeling completely detached from the constraints of time. Jimin shifted, his movement causing a soft rustle of wool that sounded like a secret being shared. He reached out, his fingertips barely brushing the sleeve of Hosak's sweater, a small gesture of connection that anchored them both. Hosak didn't move, but a small, sleepy smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He felt the warmth of the tea still radiating from the bottom of his cup, a lingering heat that mirrored the glow of the dim lamp. The room had shrunk to the size of their circle, leaving the rest of the world to be washed away by the gray mist outside. Taehyung's breathing had slowed to a rhythmic cadence, his chest rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic motion. He was no longer tracing maps on the ceiling. He had drifted into that hazy middle ground where thoughts become colors and colors become sounds. To him, the drumming of the rain sounded like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping on a wooden tabletop, urging him to let go of the last remaining threads of wakefulness. He felt a soft weight on his shoulder. Jungkook had leaned over in his sleep, their bodies overlapping in a tangle of soft fabrics and shared warmth. Jimin and Hosak share a quiet moment of physical connection, reinforcing their bond through small gestures. Taehyung drifts deeper into sleep, perceiving the sound of the rain as a gentle invitation to let go. The scene concludes with the members huddled together, their bodies overlapping in a state of shared warmth and complete slumber. The members drift toward a deep sleep, feeling isolated from the city in their tranquil sanctuary. Through dim lighting and synchronized breathing, they reach a state of complete physical and mental relaxation. The evening ends as the group huddles together in shared warmth and trust, finally succumbing to sleep. "Wait," Jin whispered, the word barely a ripple in the stillness. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but rather to the heavy, peaceful atmosphere that had settled over them like a quilt. He reached over to the side table, his fingers grazing the cool ceramic of a small bell they used to signal the end of the evening. But he didn't ring it. Instead, he simply let his hand linger there, savoring the feeling of the room's shared inertia. The air felt thick and sweet, saturated with the kind of quiet that only exists when 7 people are completely at ease with one another. Suga's breathing had become deep and cavernous, the kind of sleep that claims a person entirely. He shifted his weight, his shoulder brushing against Jungkook's, and the movement was slow, like a tide receding from the shore. There was no conscious effort to stay awake anymore. The effort of existing had been replaced by the simple, effortless act of breathing. Beside him, Jungkook's head had slumped further onto Taehyung, his features smoothed into a mask of absolute tranquility. The amber light of the lamp, now just a distant, golden smudge in the periphery of his vision. Jin acknowledges the profound peace of the room, choosing not to disturb the silence. The members have fully surrendered to sleep, with Suga and Jungkook drifting into a state of total physical and mental relaxation. The amber lighting fades as they succumb to a deep, effortless slumber together. Namjoon let the indigo journal slip from his fingers, the book landing with a muted thud on the velvet cushion. He didn't bother to pick it up. He felt a strange, floating sensation, as if the floor beneath them had turned into a cloud. He looked at the others, their silhouettes softened by the dim light, their forms blending into the shadows and the wool blankets. It was as if they were all dissolving into a single, collective entity of warmth and safety. The rain continued its relentless, rhythmic drumming, but it no longer sounded like weather. It sounded like a heartbeat, steady and protective. Jimin's humming had ceased, replaced by a soft, fluttering sigh. He had curled himself into a tight ball, his forehead resting against the fabric of the sofa, his eyes closed tight. In the silence, he could hear the house settling the old wood groaning softly as it contracted in the cool night air. These sounds, which might have been unsettling in a different context, felt like the house was whispering to them, telling them that the doors were locked, the fire was warm, and the world outside was far enough away to be forgotten. Do you remember that one summer? Hosak murmured, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, clear well. He didn't open his eyes, but a small, nostalgic smile played on his lips. The one where we found that old bookstore with the leaking roof. Namjoon experiences a sense of weightlessness and unity as he watches his companions drift off to sleep. The rhythmic rain and the settling sounds of the house create a protective cocoon of security around the group. As he slips toward consciousness, Hosak faintly recalls a shared memory of a rainy summer, adding a layer of nostalgia to the serene atmosphere. The memory drifted through the room like a slow-moving current, pulling them all back to a sun-drenched afternoon years ago, where the smell of old paper and damp cedar had mirrored this same sense of sanctuary. For a moment, the drumming of the current rain seemed to blend with the ghost of that distant summer, creating a bridge across time. No one answered, but the shared silence was an agreement, a collective nodding of heads in the half-light. The memory didn't disrupt the peace, it only deepened it, adding a layer of shared history to the warmth of the wool blankets. Jin shifted his gaze from the window to the group, his eyes softening. He noticed a small, stray thread on the edge of the blanket covering Jimin, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out to tuck the fabric more securely around the younger man's shoulders. The movement was barely a ripple in the stillness, a quiet act of stewardship. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for this specific configuration of people, the way they fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been solved. Hosak's mention of a shared memory brings a sense of historical continuity and emotional depth to the group's current tranquility. This nostalgic reflection reinforces their bond without waking them from their slumber. Jin quietly ensures the others are warm and comfortable, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for their kinship as they settle into a final, unified state of rest. Taehyung stirred slightly, a small, sleepy mumble escaping his lips. He wasn't awake, not truly, but he reached out blindly with one hand, his fingers brushing against the velvet of the sofa until he found the edge of Namjoon's sleeve. He gripped the fabric loosely, a subconscious tether to ensure he wasn't drifting too far into the gray mist of his dreams. Namjoon didn't pull away. He simply leaned his head back against the chair, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the house. The amber light of the lamp flickered once, then steadied, casting a long, honey-colored path across the rug toward the coffee table. Beside it, the river stones remained in their silent spiral, their polished surfaces reflecting the dimness like small, dark mirrors. The house seemed to exhale, the walls absorbing the rhythmic drumming of the rain, until the sound was no longer something they heard, but something they felt, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in their chests, anchoring them to the earth while their minds drifted. Suga's head lolled further to the side, his chin dipping toward his chest. In the heavy, velvet silence, the sound of a single page in the indigo journal fluttering in a phantom draft sounded like a distant wing beat. He didn't stir. The weight of the evening had become a physical presence, a warm, invisible blanket that smoothed over every thought and worry. He felt the subtle shift of Jungkook beside him, a soft adjustment of limbs that felt less like a movement and more like the natural settling of a riverbed. Jimin let out a breath that was almost a hum, a tiny, lingering note that dissolved into the air before it could reach anyone else. He felt the same pull that Taehyung had felt, the magnetic draw of their collective warmth. He shifted his weight, his shoulder pressing against the soft curve of Hosak's arm, and found that the boundary between where he ended and the others began had become blurred. They were a constellation of soft breaths and slow heartbeats, drifting together through a sea of dim light and wool. Jin finally allowed his own eyes to close, the image of his friends etched into the back of his eyelids. He thought of the rain outside, how it was currently painting the world in shades of charcoal and slate, erasing the sharp lines of the city and the frantic pace of the streets. Here, in this pocket of stillness, the only clock that mattered was the one they carried in their own pulses. He felt a stray drop of condensation slide down the window pane, a silent traveler in the night, and he imagined it was a messenger from the wild, telling the house that it was safe to sleep. The amber light of the lamp finally flickered and died, not with a pop, but with a slow, graceful fade that left the room bathed in the deep indigo of a moonless night. In the sudden dimness, the world shrunk even further, until the only reality was the tactile press of wool against skin, and the rhythmic, heavy percussion of the rain on the roof. The darkness wasn't empty. It was thick and velvety, acting as a final curtain that closed off the living room from the rest of the universe. Namjoon felt the heavy pull of sleep dragging at his eyelids, a sweet, irresistible weight. He didn't fight it. He let his thoughts drift, untethered, floating like the tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. He thought of the poet in the indigo journal, wondering if that man had also sat in a room like this, listening to a similar rain, feeling the same profound sense of belonging. The idea didn't require an answer. It was simply a comforting thought to carry into the depths of sleep, a quiet thread of continuity that linked them all across the centuries. Beside him, Jungkook let out a soft, whistling breath, his head now fully resting on Taehyung's shoulder. The two of them had drifted into a synchronized slumber, their breathing creating a slow, undulating wave of sound that acted as a counterpoint to the rain. Taehyung's grip on Namjoon's sleeve loosened, his fingers trailing off the fabric as he surrendered completely to the haze. There was a lightness to the moment, a feeling of absolute safety that stripped away every defense, leaving them all open and peaceful in their shared vulnerability. Hoseok shifted his head, resting it against the back of the sofa, his eyes long since closed. In the silence, he could hear the distant, muffled chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It didn't skip a beat this time. It sounded distant, almost underwater, as if it were calling out from another room in another life. He smiled faintly, the expression barely touching his lips, and let the sound wash over him, treating it as a signal that the night had officially claimed them. The house seemed to sigh, the old floorboards settling into the silence with a soft, organic creak that felt more like a greeting than a sound. The indigo darkness of the room had become a living thing, wrapping around them, blurring the edges of the velvet cushions and the knitted wool, until they were no longer 7 distinct figures, but a single, breathing island of warmth. The rain had shifted its tempo, moving from a heavy drum beat to a steady, hypnotic shush, as if the sky were whispering a secret to the slate roof, urging everyone inside to let go of the last remnants of the waking world. Suga felt a stray curl of hair tickle his forehead, but he didn't move to brush it away. He was suspended in that golden hour of drowsiness, where the body feels heavy as stone, but the mind feels light as air. He could feel the warmth of Jungkook's shoulder pressing against his own, a steady, radiating heat that acted as a compass in the dark. There was no need for words, no need for plans or schedules. The only requirement was the synchronized rhythm of their breathing, a slow, tidal ebb and flow that mirrored the distant pulse of the rain. Jimin's hand, draped loosely across the fabric of the sofa, twitched slightly, his fingers brushing against the wool. In his half-dream, he imagined they were all floating on a giant, soft raft, drifting down a river of starlight toward a place where the only sound was the humming of a low, distant cello. He felt the subtle shift of Hosak leaning closer, a subconscious movement born of a lifelong trust, and the sensation of it anchored him. It was a silent promise of presence, a quiet assurance that no one was drifting alone into the night. Taehyung's breathing had become so slow, it was almost imperceptible, a delicate thread of sound that wove itself into the fabric of the room. He was no longer aware of the room's boundaries or the presence of the furniture. He only knew the softness of the cushion beneath him and the comforting weight of Jungkook's head on his shoulder. The world had shrunk to the size of a single heartbeat, a small, sacred space where the chaos of the city was nothing more than a faded memory, replaced by the same profound peace that had filled the bookstore years ago. Is it just me, or is the air getting heavier? Jin murmured, though his voice was so soft it barely registered as a sound. He didn't move to investigate. He simply let the observation hang in the indigo air, a small, curious thought that drifted away as quickly as it had arrived. The air had indeed changed, becoming a thick, velvet blanket that seemed to muffle the very concept of time. It felt as though the house had finally closed its eyes, pulling the curtains of the world shut to protect the 7 of them in their collective slumber. Namjoon's hand remained resting near the fallen journal, his fingers brushing the velvet of the sofa in a slow, rhythmic motion. He was hovering on the precipice of a dream, where the boundaries of the room began to dissolve. He imagined the walls were made of old, weathered pages of a book, and the rain outside was the sound of a pen scratching across parchment, writing a story of a place where no one ever had to rush. The rhythmic shush of the rain was the only clock left, a steady, unchanging frequency that smoothed over the edges of his consciousness. In the deep silence, Jungkook shifted, his breath hitching for a second before settling into a deep, cavernous sigh. He subconsciously tightened his hold on Taehyung, his arm draping across the other's chest in a gesture of instinctive protection. Taehyung didn't wake. Instead, he let out a small, contented hum that vibrated against Jungkook's shoulder. A tiny, humming bird of a sound that dissolved into the darkness. They were locked in a peaceful geometry of limbs and wool, a puzzle of shared warmth that made the chilly night air outside feel like a distant, irrelevant rumor. Suga felt the slow, steady pulse of his own heart, synchronizing with the low vibration of the house. He was no longer thinking in words, but in textures, the rough knit of the blanket, the smooth velvet of the sofa, the radiating warmth of his friends. He felt a profound sense of arrival, as if they had been traveling toward this specific moment of stillness for years, and had finally reached the destination. The darkness was not a void, but a sanctuary, a deep, honeyed shade that cradled them all in a state of absolute, unwavering safety. The rain had transitioned into a steady, muted thrum, a sound so constant it had ceased to be a noise, and had instead become the very fabric of the room. In the deep indigo of the living room, the boundaries between the seven of them continued to blur, their breathing weaving together into a single, slow tide. It was as if they had become a shared organism of comfort, a cluster of warmth anchored to the earth by the heavy velvet of the sofa and the weight of the wool blankets. Jimin shifted in his sleep, his head sliding further into the crook of Hosak's arm. The movement was instinctive, a search for the highest concentration of heat, and he found it in the steady, radiating warmth of his friend. He didn't wake, but a tiny, soft smile touched his lips, as if he were dreaming of a sun-drenched field where the grass felt like silk beneath his feet. The scent of chamomile still lingered in the air, a faint, ghostly trail that acted as a gentle guide, leading them deeper into the hazy architecture of their dreams. Namjoon felt his consciousness fraying, the same way an old piece of lace dissolves into the air. He was no longer aware of the indigo journal or the poetry within its pages. Instead, he was experiencing the poems as colors, deep violets and muted golds that pulsed in time with the rain. He felt the slight, rhythmic pressure of Taehyung's hand on his sleeve, a tether that kept him from from floating entirely away. He didn't move to wake the younger man. He simply let the connection be his anchor, a silent acknowledgement that they were safe together and utterly still. Across the room, Jin was the last to fully surrender. He lay with his eyes closed, listening to the collective symphony of their breathing. He could hear the subtle, rhythmic huff of Jungkook's breath against Taehyung's shoulder, and the deep, cavernous sigh of Suga. It was a music more complex and beautiful than any composition he had ever heard. A song of absolute trust and shared vulnerability. He felt a profound sense of contentment, a feeling that the world outside, with its clocks, its noise, and its demands, had simply ceased to exist. The silence of the house had become a tangible thing, a soft, invisible layer of dust that settled over the furniture and their resting forms. In the deep indigo of the room, the only movement was the slow, synchronized rise and fall of 7 chests, a collective tide that ebbed and flowed with a singular, peaceful rhythm. The air was heavy, not with humidity, but with the weight of shared exhaustion and the profound relief of having nowhere else to be. It was the kind of stillness that didn't just occupy space, but created it, a vast, internal landscape where the only landmarks were the warmth of a shoulder and the scent of lingering tea. Suga's consciousness drifted into a place where the sound of the rain transformed into a distant, rhythmic percussion, a heartbeat for the entire house. He felt the subtle, comforting pressure of Jungkook's weight against him, a grounding force that kept him from floating away into the velvet dark. In this state of suspension, the boundaries of the physical world felt porous. He could almost feel the rain soaking into the slate roof above them, the water being absorbed by the earth, and the house holding them all in a protective, wooden embrace. Taehyung's dream began to take shape, a soft-edged vision of the bookstore from years ago. But now it was expanded into a sprawling library of floating shelves and velvet corridors. He could hear the others breathing in his dream, a soft, humming chorus that guided him through the corridors of memory. Even in his sleep, his hand remained loosely curled around the fabric of Namjoon's sleeve, a subconscious anchor that ensured the dream remained a shared experience, a quiet agreement that they were drifting together toward the same horizon of rest. Jimin let out a small, fluttering sigh, his head shifting slightly against Hosak's arm. The movement was so slight it barely disturbed the air, yet it sent a ripple of warmth through the group, a subtle shift in the geometry of their huddle. Hosak responded with a slow, deep exhale, his body sinking further into the sofa as if he were merging with the fabric. They were no longer separate entities, but a single, breathing organism of comfort, a cluster of warmth that defied the damp chill of the night pressing against the glass. The grandfather clock in the hallway finally let out a long, slow chime, though the sound was so dampened by the thickness of the air that it felt less like a bell and more like a vibration in the floorboards. It was a soft, distant signal, a reminder that time was still moving elsewhere. But within the velvet confines of the living room, time had become a liquid thing, pooling around them in a deep, stagnant reservoir of peace. Namjoon's grip on the edge of his consciousness finally loosened, and he let himself slide fully into the current, his thoughts becoming as fragmented and soft as the rain hitting the eaves. Beside him, Jungkook's breathing shifted into the slow, rhythmic cadence of a deep sleep, his chest rising and falling in a perfect, mirrored sync with Taehyung. There was a subtle, instinctive movement, a slight tightening of an arm, a shift of a shoulder, as they settled even further into one another, like two pieces of a puzzle finally locking into place. The warmth between them was a physical barrier, a shield that turned the living room into a fortress of shared heat, making the dark, indigo air around them feel like a protective cocoon. Suga's mind drifted to the rhythm of the house, the way the wind occasionally brushed against the eaves with a low, mournful sigh that only served to make the interior feel more secure. He felt the ghost of a smile on his lips, a lingering remnant of the contentment that had settled in his bones. He was no longer aware of the boundary between his own body and the velvet of the sofa. He was simply a part of the stillness, a note in a long, sustained chord of silence that stretched from the corners of the room to the very center of their huddle. Jin, drifting in the same golden haze, felt the weight of his own eyelids become a luxury. He thought of the rain as a curtain, one that had fallen across the world to give them this momentary sanctuary. He didn't need to see the others to know they were there. He could feel the collective gravity of their presence, a steady, humming energy that acted as a heartbeat for the entire room. It was a feeling of absolute, uncomplicated belonging, the kind that required no explanation and no promise, only the simple act of existing in the same space. The rain had transitioned from a drumming percussion to a rhythmic, liquid whisper, a sound so consistent it became the very air they breathed. In the deep indigo of the room, the boundaries of the 7 men continued to blur, their silhouettes merging into a single, undulating wave of warmth. It was a collective surrender, a quiet agreement to let the world dissolve until there was nothing left but the tactile press of wool and the slow, heavy thrum of shared heartbeats. Jimin shifted his head, his cheek brushing against the soft knit of Hosak's sweater. The movement was infinitesimal, yet it anchored them both in a shared state of weightlessness. He felt the subtle, radiating heat of the others, a constellation of warmth that acted as a compass in the dark. In his half-dream, he imagined the living room had transformed into a giant, velvet boat, drifting slowly down a river of midnight blue, carrying them toward a place where the only requirement was to remain still. Suga's breathing had become deep and cavernous, the kind of sleep that erases the concept of time. He felt the subtle, instinctive pressure of Jungkook's shoulder against his own, a grounding force that kept him from floating entirely away into the velvet haze. There was no longer any thought of the music library or the day's tasks. There was only the physical reality of this moment, the softness of the cushions, the heavy scent of chamomile, and the unwavering security of his friend's presence. Taehyung's grip on Namjoon's sleeve had finally loosened, his fingers trailing off the fabric as he sank deeper into the same honeyed slumber. He was no longer tracing maps on the ceiling. Instead, he was sailing through a landscape of muted gold and soft shadows, guided by the same rhythmic shush of the rain that now acted as a lullaby for the entire house. Beside him, Jungkook let out a final, long exhale, his features completely smoothed into a mask of absolute tranquility, his head resting heavily on Taehyung's shoulder in a perfect, unthinking symmetry. "I wonder if the rain ever actually stops," a voice murmured, though it was barely more than a ghostly vibration in the air. It was Namjoon, though he wasn't sure if he had spoken aloud, or if the thought had simply leaked into the room. He didn't open his eyes. The darkness was too comfortable to disturb. He felt as though he were suspended in a jar of warm honey, the viscosity of the silence protecting them from the sharp edges of the outside world. Beside him, the tangle of limbs shifted. Jungkook let out a soft, whistling sigh in his sleep, his weight shifting just enough to pull Taehyung deeper into the velvet embrace of the sofa. This movement triggered a slow-motion chain reaction. Taehyung leaned further into the curve of the cushion, and Hoseok, sensing the shift in the collective gravity, tilted his head until it rested securely against the back of the sofa. They were like a series of fallen dominoes, not crashing, but leaning into one another with a gentle, inevitable grace. The house seemed to respond to their stillness with a soft, rhythmic creak of the floorboards, a sound like the ship's hull groaning under the pressure of a calm sea. Jimin's breathing had become a delicate, fluttering cadence, his chest rising and falling in a mirror image of the rain's pulse. In the deep indigo of the room, the scent of chamomile had faded into something cleaner and cooler. The smell of damp slate and old wood, which only served to make the interior warmth feel more precious. It was a sanctuary built not of walls, but of shared breath. Jin felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of lightness, as if the gravity of the room had shifted and he were floating a few inches above the velvet. He didn't stir. He simply allowed himself to be carried by the current of their collective peace. He could feel the subtle, radiating heat of the others, a map of warmth that told him exactly where everyone was without needing to see them. To his left, Suga's breathing was a deep, steady anchor. To his right, the soft, rhythmic huff of the younger ones. It was a physical manifestation of a promise kept, that no matter how loud the city became, they would always find this specific kind of silence together. The rain had shifted its voice again, transitioning from a whisper into a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very foundations of the house. It was no longer an external sound, but a tactile presence, a heavy, liquid curtain that sealed the living room into a vacuum of absolute serenity. In this deep, honeyed darkness, the boundaries of the room had vanished entirely, leaving only the warmth of the wool and the steady, rhythmic pulse of 7 hearts beating in a slow, unhurried synchronization. Jungkook stirred, not to wake, but to seek a deeper level of comfort. He shifted his arm, his hand brushing against the soft fabric of Taehyung's sweater, before coming to rest in a loose, protective curl across the other's shoulder. Taehyung responded with a subconscious lean, his head sinking deeper into the velvet of the sofa. His breathing becoming a delicate, fluttering echo of Jungkook's. They had become a single, entwined shape of sleep, their shared warmth creating a small, private sun in the center of the indigo room. Beside them, Suga's consciousness had drifted into a place of pure texture. He was no longer thinking in words or memories. He was simply experiencing the heavy, comforting weight of the air and the radiating heat of his friends. He felt the subtle, rhythmic rise and fall of the person next to him, a steady, biological clock that replaced the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a feeling of absolute arrival, a sense that the search for peace had ended the moment they all collapsed into this shared velvet sanctuary. Jimin's head tilted slightly, his cheek pressing against the knit of Hosak's shoulder. In the quiet, the sound of their collective breathing had become a symphony, a slow, tidal ebb and flow that mirrored the rain's cadence. Hosak's hand, still loosely draped near the coffee table, twitched once, a tiny, instinctive movement of contentment. They were drifting together through a sea of muted gold and deep violets, a constellation of trust that anchored them to the earth, even as their minds floated far beyond the walls of the house. We are just a collection of heartbeats now, Namjoon thought, though the thought was so heavy with sleep that it barely registered as a conscious reflection. He felt the physical boundary of his own body dissolving, merging with the velvet of the chair and the radiating warmth of the friends pressed against him. The rain had reached a crescendo of consistency, a white noise wall that effectively erased the memory of the city, the streetlights, and the distant, frantic hum of traffic. Inside this pocket of the world, the only thing that possessed any mass was the shared comfort of their proximity. Suga's breathing had become a slow, deep tide, each exhale a quiet surrender to the gravity of the room. He felt the subtle, rhythmic press of Jungkook's shoulder against his own, a grounding, tactile reassurance that he was not drifting alone. In the deep indigo of the same room, the scent of the lingering tea had evolved into something more primal and comforting, like the smell of a library in winter. It was a sensory anchor, a quiet tether that kept them all from floating away into the vast, velvet void of their dreams. Jimin let out a small, fluttering sigh, his head shifting an inch further into the crook of Hosak's arm. The movement was infinitesimal, yet it triggered a soft, synchronized adjustment among the others, a subconscious realignment of limbs and blankets. They shifted as a single unit, a slow motion collapse into a state of total interdependence. There was no longer any need for individual space. The shared heat was a currency they all traded in, a collective warmth that turned the chilly night air into a distant, irrelevant rumor. Jin, suspended in the hazy borderlands of sleep, felt a stray thought drift through his mind like a leaf on a stream. He wondered if the rain would still be falling when they woke, or if the world would be scrubbed clean by the morning. He didn't need an answer. The uncertainty of tomorrow was a luxury he could afford in this moment, because the present was so saturated with peace that it felt permanent. He let his consciousness fray at the edges, dissolving into the same honeyed rhythm that had claimed the others. The rain had shifted its tone once more, transitioning from a heavy percussion into a rhythmic, metallic purr that vibrated through the slate roof and deep into the floorboards. In the velvet darkness of the room, the air felt as thick as a heavy curtain, insulating them from the very concept of time. Namjoon, drifting in the shallows of a dream, felt the physical sensation of the house breathing with them, the old wood expanding and contracting in a slow, organic pulse that mirrored the collective rise and fall of their chests. Beside him, Taehyung's breathing had become a delicate, fluttering cadence. He was no longer anchored by the fabric of Namjoon's sleeve. Instead, he had drifted into a state of total surrender, his body molding into the curve of the sofa and the warmth of Jungkook. The two of them had become a single, entwined silhouette of sleep, their shared heat creating a small, private sun in the center of the indigo room. Every small, unconscious shift of a limb was a silent conversation, an instinctive agreement to remain close, to keep the cold of the outside world at bay. Suga's consciousness was now a distant smudge, a flicker of awareness that only registered the comforting weight of his friend's proximity. He felt the subtle, rhythmic press of Jungkook's shoulder against his own, a tactile reassurance that acted as a compass in the dark. There was no more thought of melodies or lyrics, only the biological clock of their synchronized heartbeats. He was suspended in a state of absolute arrival, as if the entire journey of his life had been leading him to this specific point of stillness. this exact configuration of wool and trust. Jimin's head had tilted further, his cheek resting against the soft knit of Hosak's sweater. He was lost in a dream of floating libraries and rain-washed gardens, where the sound of the storm was a distant, melodic humming. Beside him, Hosak had sunk so deeply into the cushions that he seemed to have merged with the furniture, his breathing a slow, deep tide that anchored the group. They were a constellation of warmth, a cluster of humanity that turned the vast, empty night into something intimate and small. The house seemed to tilt slightly, not in reality, but in the way a boat leans into a gentle current, carrying them deeper into the subconscious. In the thick, velvet silence, the sound of a single, stray raindrop hitting the window pane became a thunderclap of clarity, though it didn't wake them. Instead, it acted as a rhythmic anchor, pulling their drifting minds back toward the physical sensation of the room. The amber glow of the dead lamp was now a memory, replaced by a deep, comforting indigo that smoothed over the edges of the furniture and the contours of their bodies. Jin felt a slow, warm pressure against his side. Suga had shifted in his sleep, his head now resting against Jin's shoulder. The contact was effortless and natural, a quiet admission of trust that required no waking consciousness to authorize. Jin didn't move. He simply allowed his own breathing to synchronize with the steady, subterranean pulse of Suga's. They were no longer 7 distinct individuals, but a singular breathing sculpture of warmth and wool, an island of safety in a world washed away by the gray mist of the storm. Namjoon's mind had become a series of soft, overlapping images. The texture of the indigo journal, the smell of damp earth, and the rhythmic, distant chime of the grandfather clock. He felt a sudden, fleeting sensation of weightlessness, as if the sofa had dissolved and they were all floating on a sea of dark velvet. He didn't fight the feeling. He leaned into the void, letting the collective heat of his friends act as a compass, ensuring that even in the depths of sleep, he knew exactly where he belonged. Beside him, the entwined forms of Taehyung and Jungkook had settled into a profound stillness. Jungkook's hand, still curled protectively over Taehyung's shoulder, twitched once, a small, instinctive gesture of affection that echoed through the silence. Taehyung's response was a faint, contented mumble, a sound that didn't form words, but conveyed a sense of absolute security. They had drifted into a shared dream, a place where the rain was a soft, golden curtain, and the only map they needed was the sound of each other's heartbeats. "The rain sounds like it's trying to tell us something," Jimin whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words had actually escaped his lips, or if they were simply a thought drifting through the velvet dark. He was barely conscious, his mind a kaleidoscope of soft colors and humming sounds, but he felt the physical reality of the room as a warm, enveloping weight. He shifted his head slightly, his temple resting against the coarse, comforting weave of Hosak's sweater. The world had shrunk to the size of their circle, and in that small space, every breath was a shared secret, every heartbeat a rhythmic promise of safety. Suga's consciousness was now a distant, flickering light, barely illuminating the sensation of the sofa beneath him. He felt the subtle, grounding pressure of Jin's shoulder against his own, a tactile anchor that prevented him from floating away entirely into the indigo haze. There was no more thought of the music they had written or the stages they had stood upon. There was only the biological reality of this moment, the slow, tidal ebb and flow of 7 chests rising and falling in a perfect, unhurried synchronization. He felt a profound sense of arrival, as if the entire trajectory of his life had been leading him to this specific point of stillness. Beside them, the entwined shapes of Taehyung and Jungkook had reached a state of absolute equilibrium. Jungkook's breathing had become a low, steady thrum, a counterpoint to the rhythmic shush of the rain on the roof. He had drifted into a sleep so deep that he was no longer aware of where his own shoulder ended and Taehyung's began. They were a single, cohesive entity of warmth, a fortress of shared heat that turned the chilly night air into a distant, irrelevant rumor. A small, instinctive sigh escaped Taehyung, a sound of complete surrender that resonated through the quiet like a soft, golden chord. Namjoon let his head sink deeper into the cushion, his thoughts dissolving into a series of abstract images. The smell of old paper, the cool touch of a river stone, and the rhythmic drumming of the storm. He felt a strange, floating sensation, as if the house were a great wooden ship sailing slowly through a sea of midnight blue. He didn't fight the current, he leaned into it, letting the collective heat of his friends act as his only map. The boundaries of the room had vanished, leaving only the tactile press of wool and the unwavering security of their proximity. "I think the house is dreaming with us," Hosak murmured, his voice a soft, grainy texture that barely disturbed the indigo air. He didn't open his eyes, fearing that the sudden intrusion of sight would break the spell of their shared weightlessness. He could feel the rhythmic vibration of the floorboards beneath them, a slow, organic pulse that seemed to synchronize with the heavy drumming of the rain. In this state of half-sleep, he felt as though they were no longer sitting in a living room, but were instead nestled inside a giant, warm seed, protected from the vast, cold expanse of the night by a shell of cedar and trust. Beside him, Jimin's breathing had become a delicate, fluttering echo. He shifted his head, his forehead brushing against the wool of Hosak's sleeve, a small, instinctive movement that anchored them both to the present. To Jimin, the darkness wasn't an absence of light, but a presence of comfort, a thick, velvet curtain that had smoothed away the edges of the world. He felt a stray thought drift through his mind. Something about a garden of white lilies in a summer rain. But it dissolved before he could grasp it, replaced by the radiating heat of his friends and the scent of fading chamomile. Suga felt a subtle, grounding pressure as Jin's shoulder pressed more firmly against his own. The contact was effortless, a silent dialogue of belonging that required no words. He was suspended in that same honeyed void, where the concept of tomorrow felt like a distant, irrelevant rumor. He focused on the sound of Jin's steady heartbeat, a biological clock that replaced the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a profound sense of arrival. He felt as though he had finally stopped searching for a place to rest and had simply become part of the stillness itself. Taehyung and Jungkook had drifted even deeper into their entwined slumber, their silhouettes blending into a single, soft shape of gray and navy wool. Jungkook's hand had tightened slightly around Taehyung's shoulder, a subconscious gesture of protection that echoed through the silence. Taehyung responded with a faint, contented hum, a sound that vibrated in his chest and resonated through the cushions. They were sailing together through a landscape of muted gold and deep violets, guided by the rhythmic shush of the storm that continued to wash away the boundaries of the city outside. "Do you think the rain knows we're here?" Namjoon wondered, though the thought remained an internal murmur, a soft ripple in the depths of his drowsiness. He felt the house tilt again in that illusory, nautical way, as if they were all passengers on a slow-moving barge drifting toward a horizon of absolute silence. He didn't need to open his eyes to know that the others were still there. He could feel the collective warmth as a physical weight, a shared gravity that held them all in place. The indigo darkness had become so thick it felt tactile, like a heavy silk drape that had finally settled over the living room, sealing them into a sanctuary where the only currency was a slow, synchronized breath. Beside him, Jungkook's breathing had shifted into a low, rhythmic thrum, a steady bass note that underpinned the higher, fluttering sighs of Jimin and Taehyung. The two younger boys had practically merged, their limbs intertwined in a tangle of wool and trust, creating a small, radiating center of heat. Jungkook's grip on Taehyung's shoulder hadn't loosened. Instead, it had become a subconscious anchor, a silent promise that neither would drift too far into the velvet void of the night. Taehyung responded with a tiny, infinitesimal shift of his head, tucking himself further into the crook of Jungkook's arm, his breathing becoming a delicate, mirrored echo of the other's pulse. Suga felt the subtle, grounding pressure of Jin's shoulder against his own, a tactile reassurance that acted as a compass in the dark. He was no longer thinking in terms of time or space, only in terms of textures. The softness of the velvet cushion, the warmth of a nearby hand, and the rhythmic, metallic purr of the rain against the slate roof. He felt a profound sense of arrival, as if the frantic pace of their lives had finally slowed to a complete halt, leaving them here in this specific configuration of peace. The world outside the lights of Seoul, the noise of the streets, the pressure of the spotlight had been erased, replaced by the scent of old wood and the heavy, comforting presence of family. Jimin let out a breath that was almost a hum, a tiny, lingering note that dissolved into the air before it could reach anyone else. He was drifting through a dream of white libraries and rain-washed gardens, where the sound of the storm was a distant, melodic accompaniment to a song without words. He felt the rhythmic vibration of the floorboards beneath him, a slow, organic pulse that seemed to synchronize with the heavy drumming of the rain. It was as if the house itself were dreaming along with them, its old beams expanding and contracting in a slow, contented sigh. Wait, did the rain just get quieter? Jin whispered, though the question was more of a lingering thought than a query for an answer. He didn't move a muscle, afraid that any shift in posture would break the delicate architecture of their shared warmth. The rain hadn't actually stopped, but it had evolved into a soft, rhythmic patter, like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping gently on the glass, reminding them that the world still existed without demanding they return to it. He felt Suga's breathing deepen against his shoulder, a steady, subterranean pulse that anchored him to the present. Namjoon felt the indigo journal beneath his hand, though he no longer cared about the words written inside. He was focused on the same sensation as before, the feeling of the room dissolving, turning into a vast, dark ocean where they were the only island. He imagined they were all submerged in a deep, warm pool of ink, the kind that stained the pages of a poet's notebook, blurring the lines between where one person ended and the other began. The silence was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence of something thick and protective, a velvet cocoon that shielded them from the frantic expectations of the waking world. Taehyung stirred, his head shifting slightly against Jungkook's chest. In the hazy borderland of his sleep, he felt a sudden, fleeting memory of a childhood blanket, one that smelled of home and old laundry. He subconsciously tightened his hold on Jungkook's arm, seeking that same primal security. Jungkook responded with a low, guttural hum of contentment, his breath warm against Taehyung's forehead. They had reached a state of absolute equilibrium, two hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm that mirrored the slow, tidal ebb of the storm outside. The shared heat between them was a physical force, a small, private sun radiating in the center of the indigo room. Hosak's hand, draped loosely across the sofa, brushed against the edge of a wool throw. The tactile sensation was a soft, grounding, scratchy comfort that kept him from drifting too far into the void. He could hear the house settling, the occasional rhythmic creak of the floorboards that sounded like a slow-motion heartbeat. He felt the subtle, rhythmic press of Jimin's shoulder against his own, a silent conversation of trust that required no words. They were a constellation of humanity, 7 distinct points of light, now merged into a single, glowing entity of peace and shared history. Do you think the stars are still there behind the clouds? Namjoon's voice was a mere ghost of a sound, a vibration that felt more like a thought than a spoken word. He didn't expect an answer, nor did he want one. The question was simply a way to anchor his drifting mind to the vastness of the universe before he sank back into the intimacy of the room. The darkness had become an entity of its own, a thick, protective layer of ink that muffled the edges of the furniture and blurred the lines between the seven of them. He felt the slight, rhythmic pressure of the velvet sofa beneath him, and for a moment he imagined the house was a small wooden boat floating on a midnight sea, carrying them all toward a horizon of absolute silence. Beside him, Jungkook shifted, his head sliding a fraction of an inch further into the curve of Taehyung's shoulder. The movement was so subtle it was barely a ripple in the stillness, yet it triggered a chain reaction of comfort. Taehyung responded with a tiny, soft sigh, a sound of complete surrender that resonated through the air like a distant, golden chord. Their breathing had become a single, undulating wave, a synchronized pulse that acted as a counterpoint to the rhythmic shush of the rain. They were no longer two separate people, but a cohesive silhouette of shared warmth, a fortress of wool and trust that rendered the coldness of the night an irrelevant rumor. Suga felt a slow, warm pressure against his side as Jin shifted, his shoulder pressing more firmly against his own. The contact was effortless and natural, a silent dialogue of belonging that required no waking consciousness to authorize. He was suspended in a honeyed void where the concept of tomorrow felt like a distant memory. He focused on the steady, subterranean thrum of the house, the way the old floorboards groaned softly under the weight of the storm, and felt a profound sense of arrival. It was as if the frantic trajectory of their lives had finally slowed to a complete halt, leaving them here in this specific, sacred configuration of peace. Jimin's breathing had become a delicate, fluttering echo, his forehead brushing against the coarse knit of Hosak's sleeve. In his half-dream, he imagined they were all submerged in a deep, warm pool of indigo ink, the kind that stained the pages of a poet's notebook, blurring the boundaries of their individual selves. He felt the rhythmic vibration of the room, a slow, organic pulse that seemed to mirror the rise and fall of their collective chests. The air was saturated with the fading scent of chamomile, and the heavy, comforting presence of family, creating a sanctuary where the only clock that mattered was the beat of a heart. A single, stray raindrop managed to find a hairline fracture in the window seal, landing with a microscopic tink on the wooden sill. The sound was so delicate, it didn't break the silence. Instead, it acted as a tiny, crystalline punctuation mark to the heavy stillness of the room. Namjoon felt the vibration of it through the sofa, a small reminder that the external world was still there, though it felt as distant as a different planet. He let his hand drift away from the journal, his fingers now grazing the soft, worn fabric of the upholstery, feeling the way the velvet held the warmth of their bodies. Suga's breathing had reached a state of total regularity, a deep, rhythmic oscillation that seemed to pull the others into its gravity. He was no longer aware of the physical boundaries of the sofa or the weight of the blankets. He was simply a part of the collective heat, a single thread in a tapestry of shared exhaustion. In the deep indigo of the room, he felt the subtle, comforting pressure of Jin's arm draped across his shoulder, a grounding force that kept him from floating away into the velvet void. It was a silent, tactile promise. You are here. You are safe. You are not alone. Beside them, Taehyung and Jungkook had reached a point of absolute stillness, their forms so entwined they seemed to share a single heartbeat. Jungkook's head was tucked firmly into the hollow of Taehyung's shoulder, and every slow, deep exhale from one was mirrored by the other. They had drifted into a shared architecture of dreams, a place where the rain was not a storm, but a soft, golden lullaby. A tiny, unconscious smile played on Taehyung's lips, a response to a dream that only he could see, though the contentment radiated from him in waves, warming everyone within reach. Jimin shifted his weight, his head sliding further into the curve of Hosak's arm. The movement was slow, almost liquid, as if he were sinking into a warm bath of shadow and wool. He felt the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the house, the way the old beams groaned under the weight of the rain, and it felt like a lullaby sung by the building itself. He didn't open his eyes, for the darkness was a physical presence, a thick, protective blanket that smoothed over the jagged edges of the day. To him, the scent of the fading chamomile tea had become a map, guiding him deeper into a sleep that felt ancient and earned.